Have you ever been judged unfairly based on your appearance? Detective Tom Johnson faced this reality in a terrifying way when a fellow passenger accused him of being a terrorist mid-flight. Join us as we explore Tom's incredible story of resilience in the face of blatant racism. You'll feel every tense moment as if you were right there in seat 14B, watching the drama unfold. Tom Johnson stepped onto flight 287, his carry-on bag slung over his shoulder. He moved down the aisle with practiced ease, nodding politely to fellow passengers as he made his way to his seat near the emergency exit. As he settled in, Tom placed his bag under the seat in front of him, then reached inside to double-check his heart medication was easily accessible. Across the aisle, Karen White's eyes narrowed as she watched Tom's movements. She felt a twinge of unease, her gaze fixed on his hands as he zipped and unzipped his bag. Karen's mind raced, recalling recent news stories about airline security threats. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this man. Tom, oblivious to Karen's scrutiny, pulled out a book and began to read. His calm demeanor only heightened Karen's suspicions. She watched as he occasionally glanced at his watch, interpreting this ordinary action as a sign of nervousness or anticipation. Karen's internal dialogue grew more frantic with each passing minute. Why does he keep checking the time? And what's really in that bag he's so concerned about? Her heart raced as she conjured increasingly elaborate scenarios, each more far-fetched than the last. The reality of racial bias was at play, warping Karen's perception of Tom's innocent actions. What should have been seen as a passenger simply getting comfortable for a long flight was instead viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. Karen's preconceived notions about safety and danger, influenced by sensationalized media narratives, clouded her judgment. As the flight attendants began their pre-takeoff routines, Karen's unease continued to grow. She found herself fixating on Tom's every movement, her anxiety mounting with each turn of his book's pages. The confined space of the airplane amplified her fears, making her feel trapped and vulnerable. Karen debated whether to alert the flight crew. Part of her knew she might be overreacting, but another part insisted it was better to be safe than sorry. She rehearsed what she might say, trying to find words that wouldn't make her sound paranoid or, worse, prejudiced. Finally, as a flight attendant passed by her seat, Karen made her decision. With a trembling hand, she reached out and tapped the crew member's arm. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "I need to speak with you about something important." The flight attendant, a woman named Linda, paused and leaned in closer. "Of course, ma'am. What seems to be the problem?" Karen's eyes darted toward Tom, then back to Linda. "It's about that man," she murmured, nodding in Tom's direction. I think he might be dangerous." Linda's expression remained neutral, but her posture stiffened slightly. She'd been trained for situations like this, but each one presented its own unique challenges. "I understand your concern," she said softly. "Can you tell me more about what you've observed?" As Karen began to share her suspicions, Linda listened carefully, her mind already racing through protocols and procedures. She knew she'd have to balance addressing this passenger's concerns with maintaining a calm and safe environment for everyone on board. Unaware of the storm brewing around him, Tom turned another page in his book, settling in for what he expected to be an uneventful flight. Little did he know that his peaceful journey was about to take a dramatic and disturbing turn. In the confined space of the airplane cabin, a silent battle was about to unfold. On one side stood Karen's unfounded fears, on the other, Tom's blissful ignorance. And caught in the middle, a flight attendant tasked with maintaining order in the face of rising chaos. Who would emerge victorious in this high-stakes confrontation at 30,000 feet? Linda approached Karen's seat, her professional smile masking the concern brewing beneath the surface. As she leaned in, Karen's eyes darted nervously towards Tom before fixing on Linda's face. "That man over there," Karen whispered, her voice quivering with tension. "I think he's up to something. He keeps checking his bag and looking at his watch. It's suspicious." Linda's training kicked in immediately. She nodded, acknowledging Karen's concerns without validating them. "I understand, ma'am. Can you tell me more about what you've observed?" As Karen launched into a detailed account of Tom's every movement, Linda listened carefully, mentally cataloging each point against her years of experience. Karen's words painted a picture tinged with fear and prejudice. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," she muttered, her implication clear. Linda felt a twinge of discomfort at the underlying bias in Karen's assessment, but kept her expression neutral. As Karen's litany of suspicions continued, Linda found herself caught in an internal struggle. Her instincts, honed by years on the job, told her that Tom's behavior was perfectly ordinary for a passenger settling in for a long flight. Yet she couldn't dismiss Karen's concerns outright. The specter of past security incidents loomed large in her mind, a constant reminder of the potential consequences of overlooking a genuine threat. Linda took a deep breath, centering herself. She knew she had to strike a delicate balance between addressing Karen's fears and avoiding any unwarranted escalation. "I assure you, ma'am," she began, her voice low and calm, "everyone on board has gone through security. We take the safety of all our passengers very seriously." Karen's eyes widened, clearly unsatisfied with this response. She opened her mouth to protest, but Linda gently continued, "If there's anything specific you're concerned about, please let me know. We'll keep a close eye on the situation." As she spoke, Linda's gaze drifted towards Tom. He sat quietly engrossed in his book, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Linda felt a pang of sympathy, mixed with a gnawing uncertainty. What if Karen's fears, however misplaced they might seem, had some kernel of truth? Turning back to Karen, Linda offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll monitor the situation closely." She gave a subtle nod to her colleague Jim, silently communicating the need for vigilance. As Linda moved away from Karen's seat, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She'd done her best to diffuse the situation, but the tension lingering in the air told her this was far from over. Her mind raced through potential scenarios, each one more challenging than the last. Meanwhile, Tom turned another page in his book, blissfully unaware of the scrutiny he was under. The gentle hum of the airplane's engines provided a soothing backdrop to his reading, and he settled deeper into his seat, looking forward to a peaceful journey. Little did Tom know that just a few rows away, his every movement was being watched and analyzed, his innocent actions twisted into something sinister by fear and prejudice. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with unspoken accusations and mounting suspicion, setting the stage for a confrontation that would challenge everyone's assumptions and beliefs. What happens when paranoia becomes contagious at 30,000 feet? Karen's suspicions were about to infect the minds of her fellow passengers, turning a routine flight into a powder keg of misplaced fear and judgment. Karen's eyes darted nervously around the cabin as she leaned towards the woman seated next to her. "Did you notice that man?" she whispered, nodding discreetly towards Tom. "He keeps fidgeting with his bag. I think he might be dangerous." The woman's brow furrowed as she glanced at Tom, then back at Karen. "Are you sure?" "He looks pretty normal to me," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Undeterred, Karen pressed on. "I told the flight attendant, but she didn't seem to take me seriously. We need to stay alert." She turned to the couple seated behind her, repeating her concerns in hushed tones. As Karen's whispers spread through the nearby rows, a ripple of unease began to move through the cabin. Some passengers dismissed her fears outright, rolling their eyes or shaking their heads. Others, however, found themselves stealing glances at Tom, their minds racing with possibilities. The confined space of the airplane amplified the tension, creating an environment ripe for the spread of fear and misinformation. Passengers who had boarded with nothing more on their minds than reaching their destinations now found themselves caught up in a web of suspicion. A middle-aged man a few rows back leaned forward, his face etched with concern. "Maybe we should alert the captain," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. This comment sparked a heated debate among those within earshot, with opinions sharply divided. As the whispers grew, so did the pressure for action. Some passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, eyeing the call buttons above them. Others tried to catch the attention of passing flight attendants, eager to voice their concerns or seek reassurance. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing minute. What had started as one woman's unfounded suspicion was rapidly evolving into a collective anxiety. Even those who remained skeptical of Karen's claims couldn't help but feel affected by the growing tension around them. Tom, still engrossed in his book, remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. However, as the energy in the cabin shifted, he began to sense that something was amiss. He glanced up, catching a few passengers quickly averting their gaze. A frown creased his forehead as he tried to make sense of the strange atmosphere. As the situation escalated, the cabin crew found themselves facing a delicate balancing act. They moved through the aisles with practiced calm, trying to soothe nerves without drawing undue attention to the situation. Linda, in particular, kept a watchful eye on both Karen and Tom, her mind racing through potential ways to diffuse the tension. By now, a small group of passengers had fully bought into Karen's fears. They huddled together, exchanging worried glances and formulating plans of action. Others remained doubtful, watching the unfolding drama with a mix of concern and skepticism. The flight, which had begun like any other, now teetered on a knife's edge. As Tom finally began to realize he was the focus of unwanted attention, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everyone's assumptions and beliefs about safety, prejudice, and the power of fear to divide us. Tom's fingers tightened around his book as the first prickles of unease crawled up his spine. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He glanced up, catching several passengers quickly averting their eyes. A knot formed in his stomach as recognition dawned. He'd been here before, trapped in the suffocating grip of unwarranted suspicion. His mind raced, cataloging the signs he'd subconsciously picked up. The hushed whispers, the sidelong glances, the palpable tension radiating from nearby rows. Tom took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain outwardly calm even as his heart rate quickened. He'd faced this scenario countless times before, but the familiar sting of injustice never dulled. Memories of past incidents flashed through his mind. Being followed in stores, stopped for random security checks, watched warily by fellow passengers. Each time, the weight of others' baseless fears and prejudices had settled heavily on his shoulders. Tom felt a surge of frustration, knowing that once again, his mere presence had transformed him from a person into a perceived threat. He weighed his options carefully, acutely aware that any action he took could be misinterpreted. Should he confront the situation directly, attempt to reassure his fellow passengers, or simply endure the discomfort in silence? Tom's jaw tightened as he considered the potential outcomes, each fraught with its own risks. The emotional toll of these experiences washed over him anew. The constant vigilance, the need to be above reproach, the exhaustion of navigating a world where his skin color made him inherently suspect. It was a burden he carried every day. And now, trapped at 30,000 feet, that burden felt heavier than ever. Tom's mind drifted to statistics he'd read about racial profiling in air travel. The numbers were stark, revealing a pattern of discrimination that persisted despite efforts to address it. He thought of the countless other passengers of color who had sat where he now sat, subjected to the same unfounded suspicion and fear. As the tension in the cabin continued to build, Tom found himself at a crossroads. Part of him yearned to stand up, to challenge the assumptions being made about him, to assert his right to exist in this space without being deemed a threat. But another part of him, honed by years of similar encounters, urged caution. He took another deep breath, centering himself. Tom made his decision. He would remain calm and composed, refusing to let others' prejudices dictate his behavior. He turned a page in his book, his movements deliberate and unhurried. If his fellow passengers were watching for signs of threat, they would find none. Still, as Tom attempted to refocus on his reading, he couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope. Every shift in his seat, every glance at his watch, felt charged with unearned significance. He silently hoped that the situation would pass. That reason would prevail over fear. Unbeknownst to Tom, flight attendant Linda was keenly aware of the changing dynamics in the cabin. Her experienced eyes took in the growing unease among the passengers, the furtive glances cast in Tom's direction. As she moved down the aisle, outwardly calm but inwardly alert, Linda knew that the next few moments would be critical in determining how this flight would unfold. Linda's experienced eyes swept the cabin, taking in the subtle shifts in body language and the hushed whispers that rippled through the rows. The tension was palpable, a silent storm brewing at 30,000 feet. She felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders as she realized she stood at a critical juncture. Her training screamed at her to follow protocol, to treat every passenger concern with equal gravity. Yet her instincts, honed by years of reading people, told her that Tom posed no threat. Linda's mind raced, weighing the potential consequences of each course of action. Ignore Karen's concerns, and she risked overlooking a genuine security threat. Act on them too aggressively, and she could become complicit in an act of racial profiling. Linda's internal conflict intensified as she recalled the legal and ethical responsibilities that came with her uniform. She was duty-bound to ensure the safety of every soul on board, yet equally obligated to protect passengers from discrimination. The two mandates, usually aligned, now seemed at odds with each other. She thought back to her training sessions, searching for guidance. The protocols were clear on how to handle disruptive passengers or obvious security threats, but they offered little direction for navigating the murky waters of unfounded suspicion fueled by racial bias. As Linda moved through the cabin, outwardly projecting calm, her mind churned through potential approaches. She could make a general announcement reminding passengers of security measures, hoping to ease tensions without singling anyone out. Or she could speak privately with Tom, potentially alerting him to the situation while assessing any genuine cause for concern. Each option carried its own risks. A public announcement might escalate the situation, drawing unwanted attention to Tom and potentially inciting panic. A private conversation could be misinterpreted by Karen and her growing circle of sympathizers, seen as proof that their suspicions were justified. Linda's gaze fell on Tom, still engrossed in his book, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing around him. She felt a pang of empathy, imagining how it would feel to be the unwitting center of such scrutiny. Her resolve strengthened. She had to find a way to address the situation that would maintain safety without compromising dignity. The pressure to act grew with each passing moment. Linda could sense the rising anxiety among the passengers, their eyes darting between her, Karen, and Tom. She knew that inaction was no longer an option. Whatever she decided would set the tone for how this flight would unfold. Taking a deep breath, Linda made her decision. She would approach Tom discreetly under the guise of a routine check-in. It would allow her to assess the situation up close while potentially diffusing tension by demonstrating that the crew was aware and engaged. As she started towards Tom's seat, Linda steeled herself for the conversation ahead. She knew that her words and actions in the next few moments could either calm the waters or unleash a storm. With each step, the weight of her responsibility grew heavier, but so did her determination to handle this delicate situation with the professionalism and fairness it demanded. As Linda reached Tom's row, she knew that every gesture, every facial expression would speak volumes. But in a situation fraught with racial tension, could body language alone bridge the divide between suspicion and trust? Linda approached Tom's seat, her steps measured and deliberate. She plastered on her most reassuring smile, though her eyes betrayed a hint of tension. Tom looked up from his book, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly as he met Linda's gaze. "Good afternoon, sir," Linda began, her voice low and calm. "I hope you're having a pleasant flight so far. I just wanted to check if you need anything or have any concerns." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed Linda's words. He recognized the careful neutrality in her tone, the practiced ease of her smile. This wasn't a routine check-in. He set his book aside, giving Linda his full attention. "Everything's fine, thank you," Tom replied, his voice steady. He maintained eye contact, his hands resting open on his lap, a deliberate display of calm and openness. Linda nodded, her smile never wavering. "I'm glad to hear that. Some of our passengers have expressed concerns. I just wanted to address them directly with you." Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been in this situation before, and he knew the dance all too well. Every word, every movement now carried weight. He took a deep breath, centering himself. "I see her," Tom said, his tone neutral. "What sort of concerns?" Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There have been some observations about your behavior that have made a few passengers uneasy. I want to assure you that we take all passenger concerns seriously, but we also want to ensure everyone feels comfortable and respected on our flights." Tom's mind raced, considering his options. He could reveal his identity as a detective, potentially diffusing the situation immediately. But years of undercover work had ingrained in him a deep caution about revealing his true nature. Moreover, a part of him bristled at the idea of having to prove his innocence. Instead, Tom opted for a measured response. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I assure you, I'm simply here to reach my destination like everyone else. If there's anything specific I can do to alleviate these concerns, please let me know." Linda studied Tom's face, noting the quiet dignity in his expression. Her instincts, honed by years of experience, told her that this man posed no threat, yet protocol demanded she pursue the matter further. "Would you mind telling me about the contents of your bag?" Linda asked, her tone apologetic but firm. Tom nodded, reaching down to pull his bag onto his lap. "Of course," he said, unzipping it slowly. "As you can see, it's just my personal items and some medication I need to keep with me." Linda glanced at the bag's contents, noting nothing out of the ordinary. She looked back at Tom, offering a genuine smile this time. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. I apologize for any inconvenience." As Linda moved away from Tom's seat, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Karen, in particular, watched the interaction with laser focus, her expression a mix of anticipation and suspicion. The tension in the cabin seemed to crackle, waiting for a spark to ignite it into full-blown conflict. In the confined space of the airplane, tension had been building like a pressure cooker. Karen's eyes darted between Linda and Tom, her face flushed with a mix of fear and indignation. As Linda moved away from Tom's seat, something inside Karen snapped. She could no longer contain the storm of emotions brewing within her. Karen shot to her feet, her sudden movement drawing all eyes to her. "He's dangerous," she shouted, her finger jabbing accusingly in Tom's direction. "That man is hiding something, and nobody's doing anything about it." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers who had been dozing or idly chatting suddenly found themselves thrust into a situation they never expected. Heads whipped around, searching for the source of the commotion and the target of Karen's accusation. Tom remained seated, his body tense but his expression carefully neutral. He'd faced prejudice before, but never so publicly, never with such high stakes. His mind raced, weighing his options as the cabin descended into pandemonium around him. Karen's words acted like a match to kindling, igniting the fears that had been smoldering among some passengers. A man a few rows back stood up, his voice shaky but determined. "She's right. I saw him acting suspiciously too." The accusation spread like wildfire. What had begun as one woman's paranoia was rapidly transforming into a mob mentality. Passengers who moments ago had been strangers now found themselves taking sides, their judgment clouded by fear and the infectious nature of panic. Linda and her fellow flight attendants moved swiftly, trying to restore order. "Please, everyone, remain calm and in your seats," Linda called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. But her words were drowned out by the rising tide of voices. Some passengers defended Tom, their voices rising in anger at the unfounded accusations. Others demanded action, insisting that the flight crew do something, anything, to address the perceived threat. The airplane cabin, once a mundane space of travel, had become a crucible of human emotion and prejudice. Tom took a deep breath, centering himself amidst the storm raging around him. He knew that his next actions would be crucial. A wrong move could escalate the situation further, potentially putting him in real danger. But he also knew he couldn't simply sit back and let fear and ignorance win the day. Slowly, deliberately, Tom stood up. The simple action sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Some passengers flinched, others leaned forward, anticipating what would happen next. Tom raised his hands, palms out, in a universal gesture of peace. "My name is Tom Johnson," he began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the din. "I understand that some of you are afraid, but I assure you, I'm just a passenger like any of you, trying to reach my destination safely." His words seemed to hit a reset button in the cabin. The shouting diminished, replaced by a tense silence as passengers waited to see what would happen next. Karen, her face a mix of fear and defiance, opened her mouth to speak again, but Linda quickly stepped in. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Linda said firmly, positioning herself between Karen and Tom. She turned to address the entire cabin. "Everyone, I need you to calm down and listen carefully. We take all concerns seriously, but we also have a responsibility to treat every passenger with respect and dignity." As Linda spoke, other members of the flight crew moved through the cabin, speaking quietly to agitated passengers, working to diffuse the situation. The atmosphere remained tense, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Tom slowly sat back down, acutely aware of the eyes still fixed on him. He picked up his book, an act of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. As the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, Tom knew that this incident was far from over. The next few moments would be critical in determining how the rest of this flight would unfold. As the uneasy calm settled over the cabin, a silent battle was unfolding. The flight crew, armed with protocols and training, prepared to face a threat far more unpredictable than any they'd encountered before. How would they navigate this powder keg of emotions and prejudice at 30,000 feet? Linda locked eyes with her fellow crew members, a wordless exchange conveying the gravity of the situation. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the challenging moments ahead. With a subtle nod to her colleagues, Linda initiated their well-rehearsed emergency protocols. Jim, the senior flight attendant, made his way to the cockpit to brief the captain. Meanwhile, Sarah positioned herself near Karen, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. Linda approached Tom, her face a mask of professional calm despite the turmoil churning inside her. "Sir," she said in a low, steady voice, "I need you to remain in your seat. We're doing everything we can to manage this situation." Tom nodded, his jaw tight with tension, but his eyes reflecting understanding. Linda turned to address the cabin, her voice clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. We understand there are concerns, but I assure you that every passenger on this flight has passed through security. We take your safety seriously, and we ask for your cooperation as we work to resolve this misunderstanding." As Linda spoke, Jim returned from the cockpit. He leaned in close, whispering, "The captain's alerted ground control. They'll have security ready when we land." Linda nodded, her mind racing through their options. The tension in the cabin remained palpable, with some passengers still casting suspicious glances at Tom. Others seemed embarrassed by the unfolding drama, averting their eyes and sinking lower in their seats. Karen, however, remained defiant. "You're not listening," she shouted, attempting to stand again. "He's dangerous. We need to do something now." Sarah gently but firmly placed a hand on Karen's shoulder. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and remain seated. We're handling the situation." Linda felt a surge of frustration. Their efforts to de-escalate were being hampered by Karen's continued outbursts. She exchanged a glance with Jim, silently debating whether more drastic measures were necessary. Jim approached Karen, his voice low and calm. "Ma'am, if you can't control yourself, we'll need to move you to a different part of the aircraft. This behavior is disrupting the flight and causing distress to other passengers." Karen's eyes widened, a mix of indignation and fear flashing across her face. "You're going to move me? I'm not the threat here." Linda stepped in, her tone brooking no argument. "This is not a request, ma'am. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, we need you to come with us now." As Jim and Sarah carefully escorted Karen to the back of the plane, Linda addressed the remaining passengers once more. "We appreciate your patience and understanding. Please remain in your seats. If you have any concerns, don't hesitate to use your call button." With Karen isolated, the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. But Linda knew the situation remained precarious. She could feel the lingering tension, the unspoken accusations still hanging in the air. Tom sat rigid in his seat, his book forgotten in his lap. His eyes met Linda's, and she saw the weight of the ordeal etched in his features. As she held his gaze, Linda sensed that Tom was wrestling with a decision, one that could change the course of this flight entirely. The cabin fell silent as Tom stood, his presence commanding attention. Little did the passengers know, the man they had spent hours judging was about to shatter every assumption they'd made. How would they react when they discovered the truth about the threat in their midst? Tom took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. His hand reached into his pocket, retrieving a small leather wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing a gleaming badge. "My name is Detective Tom Johnson," he announced, his voice clear and unwavering. "I'm an undercover officer with the NYPD." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had been eyeing Tom with suspicion now gaped in disbelief. Some leaned forward in their seats, straining to get a better look at the badge. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, the gravity of their misjudgment sinking in. Tom continued, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "I understand the concerns some of you have had during this flight. As an officer, I'm trained to remain vigilant and aware of my surroundings. What you interpreted as suspicious behavior was simply me doing my job, even while off duty." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably. The tension that had been building for hours began to dissipate, replaced by a mix of relief and embarrassment. Some passengers lowered their heads, unable to meet Tom's gaze. Others nodded slowly, processing this unexpected turn of events. As Tom spoke, he couldn't help but reflect on the challenges of his undercover work. The constant vigilance, the need to maintain a cover identity, the isolation, all of it took a toll. This moment of revelation, while necessary, felt like a personal defeat. Years of training had ingrained in him the importance of maintaining his cover at all costs. Yet here he was, forced to reveal his true identity to a plane full of strangers. The passengers waited with bated breath, their eyes darting between Tom and Karen. How would she respond to this revelation? Karen sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The certainty that had fueled her accusations moments ago now crumbled in the face of irrefutable evidence. Tom's revelation had transformed the cabin into a crucible of conflicting emotions. Relief mingled with shame, embarrassment with anger. Some passengers began to murmur apologies, their voices tinged with genuine remorse. Others remained silent, grappling with their own reactions to the unfolding drama. As the reality of the situation sank in, a sense of collective embarrassment settled over the cabin. Passengers who had been quick to judge now found themselves confronting their own biases and prejudices. The incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers of rushed judgments and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. Linda stepped forward, her professional demeanor tinged with a hint of relief. "Thank you, Detective Johnson, for your candor," she said. "I hope this puts everyone's minds at ease." She turned to address the cabin. "I want to remind everyone that making false accusations or causing disruptions on a flight is a serious offense. Let's all take a moment to reflect on what's happened here today." As Tom returned to his seat, the cabin buzzed with hushed conversations. The flight that had begun like any other had become a powerful lesson in the consequences of unchecked fear and prejudice. As the plane continued its journey, passengers were left to ponder their roles in the drama that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. In the wake of Tom's revelation, the cabin of Flight 287 fell into a heavy silence. Passengers who had been quick to judge now found themselves grappling with the weight of their assumptions. The air felt thick with unspoken apologies and lingering shame. Karen sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The certainty that had fueled her accusations now crumbled, leaving her exposed to the harsh reality of her actions. She felt the eyes of her fellow passengers upon her, a mixture of anger and disappointment radiating from their stares. Nearby, a middle-aged man who had supported Karen's suspicions earlier now hung his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His mind raced with regret, replaying every moment he had allowed fear to cloud his judgment. He wondered how he could have been so quick to assume the worst about a stranger based solely on appearance. Across the aisle, a young woman engaged in a hushed conversation with her seatmate. "I can't believe we all just sat here and let that happen," she whispered, her voice tinged with frustration. "We should have spoken up sooner." Her companion nodded solemnly. "It's easy to say that now, but in the moment, I guess we all got caught up in the fear." He paused, considering his words carefully. This whole thing really makes you think about how quickly things can spiral out of control. As the plane began its descent, Linda made her way through the cabin, her practiced smile masking the turmoil she felt inside. She knew that the consequences of this incident would extend far beyond this flight. The psychological impact on Tom, the lasting effects on Karen, the shattered trust among passengers, all of it would linger long after they touched down. Tom sat quietly, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. The relief of having cleared his name was overshadowed by a familiar weariness. How many more times would he have to prove his innocence? How many more times would he be judged based on nothing more than the color of his skin? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the tense atmosphere. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to our destination. At this time, I need to inform you that airport security will be meeting us at the gate. I ask for your continued cooperation as we handle this situation. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, wondering what would happen next. Would there be legal consequences? Would they be questioned? The uncertainty hung in the air, adding to the already palpable tension. As the plane descended through the clouds, Linda made one final announcement. "We understand this has been a difficult flight for many of you," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. When we land, we ask that you remain seated until further instructions are given." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, taxiing toward the gate. As it came to a stop, passengers could see the flashing lights of security vehicles waiting on the tarmac. The reality of what awaited them beyond the cabin doors began to sink in. In these final moments before disembarking, the passengers of Flight 287 found themselves united in an unexpected way. They had become unwitting participants in a powerful lesson about the dangers of unchecked bias and the consequences of false accusations. As they prepared to face the authorities, many silently vowed to carry this experience with them, a stark reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and the courage to stand up against injustice. The flashing lights of security vehicles greeted Flight 287 as it taxied to a stop. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats, the weight of recent events hanging heavy in the air. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, no one moved. They waited, eyes fixed on the front of the plane, anticipating what would come next. The door opened, and two airport security officers stepped into the cabin. Their presence sent a ripple of tension through the rows. Linda, her professional demeanor firmly in place, approached them and spoke in hushed tones. The officers nodded, their expressions grave. One officer moved purposefully down the aisle, stopping at Karen's seat. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. With shaking hands, she gathered her belongings. As Karen stood, the reality of her situation seemed to hit her. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked around frantically, as if seeking support from her fellow passengers. But she found only averted gazes and stony expressions. The consequences of her actions were becoming painfully clear. The officer escorted Karen towards the exit. As they passed Tom's seat, she paused, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the cabin held its breath. Tom's expression remained neutral, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the emotions roiling beneath the surface. I'm sorry," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving hers. Without another word, Karen was led off the plane. As the cabin door closed behind them, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the remaining passengers. Conversations broke out in hushed tones, a mixture of relief and lingering shock coloring their words. "I can't believe she's actually being arrested," a woman near Tom murmured to her seatmate. "What did she expect?" her companion replied. "You can't just accuse people like that and disrupt a whole flight without consequences." Tom remained silent, his mind racing. He knew the legal ramifications Karen might face: fines, potential jail time, being placed on a no-fly list. But more than that, he thought about the broader implications of what had transpired. As passengers began to disembark, many paused to offer Tom words of support or apology. He accepted them with quiet grace, but each interaction seemed to weigh on him. The burden of being the unwitting center of this drama was evident in the tightness around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. Before Tom could leave, Linda approached him. "Detective Johnson," she said softly, "the authorities would like to get a statement from you, if you're willing." Tom nodded, unsurprised. He'd known this was coming. As he followed Linda off the plane, Tom's mind wandered to the countless other incidents of racial profiling that never made headlines. How many people face similar suspicions every day without the protection of a badge to clear their name? The bright lights of the terminal seemed harsh after the dimness of the cabin. As Tom prepared to give his statement, he couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of what had happened. This flight had become a microcosm of larger societal issues: fear, prejudice, the quick rush to judgment. But it had also shown the potential for understanding and growth. Tom took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He knew his words would carry weight, not just in the official report, but in shaping how this incident would be remembered and learned from. As he began to speak, he hoped that somehow this harrowing experience might serve as a catalyst for change, however small. As the passengers of Flight 287 disembarked, the weight of recent events hung heavy in the air. The incident had laid bare the insidious nature of racial bias and its devastating consequences. Tom's ordeal served as a stark reminder that prejudice remains deeply entrenched in society, capable of turning even a routine flight into a crucible of suspicion and fear. The need for ongoing education and awareness to combat racial bias had never been more apparent. As news of the incident spread, it sparked conversations in homes, workplaces, and communities across the country. People began to examine their own biases, recognizing how easily fear and misinformation could cloud judgment and lead to unjust actions. For Tom, the experience was bittersweet. While vindicated, he couldn't shake the exhaustion of once again having to prove his innocence. He hoped his story would serve as a catalyst for change, encouraging others to confront their prejudices and work towards a more equitable society. As the last passengers trickled out of the terminal, a sense of responsibility settled over them. They had witnessed firsthand the corrosive effects of unchecked bias and the importance of standing up against injustice. Many left with a renewed commitment to challenge their own assumptions and advocate for a world where no one would face suspicion based solely on the color of their skin.